This goes back to some of the conversations we had yesterday, but I'm still struggling a little bit with what our theory of change is with the global partnership and what our kind of core offer is. And I think Brenda and someone else said yesterday that the core offer of the global partnership is around the monitoring framework and the monitoring process, and I would agree that probably is. But there's two challenges to that. One is we all recognize there's many more actors and flows, both on the so-called provider and on the so-called recipient side, particularly with the new agendas. And how, if monitoring is the critical part of that, should we be trying to develop a framework that actually works for all of those actors and all of those flows? And that becomes incredibly complicated if that's what we're trying to do. And this spoke to Paddy's session that he chaired also in private sector. So that's one issue. Related to that, Brenda, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the Paris Declaration Evaluation, I think it was of 2011. I know that was the old agenda, but my understanding was that some of that said that there had been a greater voice for countries and that the Paris Declaration had helped to enable countries and empower them a little bit. Is that true? And if so, is that continuing? And how does that relate to what our theory of change, of why Nairobi will actually make a difference to anybody's lives?
Mm-hmm. Great. And then on the same table.
I suppose it's just a comment. Sorry, my name's Thomas Tishar, and I work independently now, but I spent the last few years working on market systems approaches, which is very much about the doing development differently. And so I can say from personal experience the huge frustration of having to follow a linear approach where clearly things are never linear and you have to go back and forth and have that degree of negotiation. And I'd really like to hear from either panelists or from other people in the audience what the challenge would be or difficulty of adopting something, a more adaptive programming, which could be about how do you do measurement differently, but because the underlying approach is really, it sounds a bit fluffy, but it is about a greater degree of trust and mutual accountability, which was mentioned earlier. And what would it take to sort of to allow oneself to be more adaptable rather than just having a very linear process, which it seems that either success or failure is very dichotomous, where it could be something in between, which is what people live every day, but somehow doesn't seem to be reflected on paper.
Great. And then there was a comment at the back from Jan.
Thank you very much. I think it all started going pretty well this morning with the breakfast, and it's even improving. I think we talk about the two P words that are critical: power and politics. I also think we started talking about institutions, incentives, and the stuff that makes development so intriguing, but also so very, very difficult. I think for this agenda, I mean, Ed started asking, do we have to do something different, or do we have to try harder? I guess we have to try to do something different. And there were very good examples of how to do that, I think. But some of the practices in the past, I think we should revisit. If I have a look, or I took a look at the evaluation, it was mentioned, the 2011 evaluation of the 5 basic principles. I had to look at the 2008 evaluation, which blandly spoke about the political economy of aid and the aid effectiveness agenda as it was still then. Meanwhile, I think we have moved a lot beyond that. We have gone into the development effectiveness work, but unfortunately, I think we have forgotten to look at some of the practices that were put, that were attempted to make aid more effective and now make development more effective. I'm thinking, for example, of the Code of Conduct of the European Union, which was an attempt by the 28, it wasn't 28 at that time, but it was an attempt by member states and the Commission to work more effectively together, to agree on complementarity, for example, or where to work together. And it started, for example, with deciding on let's work on 3 sectors rather than have all donors work on all sectors. Did we ever bother to look at how that was implemented? Did we look at the evaluation that was done by the Commission itself? It's this type of stuff, I think, that would help us tremendously. It's not going to something extremely new, but try to look at the old commitments and have some more in-depth research on why things didn't work. I very much agree also on the DDD. I'd like to add another acronym, if you don't mind, just to make us feel less lonely, which is the TWP, thinking and working politically. There is another community of practice that is also taking on this agenda of how can we be more knowledgeable about some of these principles, but especially why they don't get implemented. What is obstructing implementation of something that we have collectively agreed on?
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a couple more hands up. We'll take those and then come back to the panel. So Nilima, and then Johnny, and then I'll bring us back.
Thanks. Nilima Gulrajani, ODI. I just wonder whether the Doing Development Differently manifesto and its kin is trying to achieve something quite different from the GPDC. I think that the development effectiveness principles are, in a sense, about trying to ensure that aid or development remains relevant to all stakeholders, so increasing the number of stakeholders in the agenda. I see the DDD manifesto as much more operationally focused. And I wonder whether you're forcing a square peg into a round hole by bringing the two together, and potentially also undermining the value added of DDD, which is essentially its problem-driven nature, to then codify that into a set of global principles that all must use. I wonder whether you're taking away from its unique selling point. And I also wonder whether, being pragmatic about things, donors are going to have to embrace DDD principles. If you just look at the increasing work in fragile states, for example, I think donors are going to be forced to embrace those principles, irrespective of not whether they're codified as formal grand principles within the GPDC.
Okay. And then a final question was from Jonathan Glennie, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Thank you. Jonathan Glennie, I'm at Ipsos, which is a global research company. And I've worked, for many years on these issues. I have to say my current analysis of the global partnership is a pretty skeptical one. I would say a very skeptical one. I think that when you look, when we walked out of Busan, literally they just signed the accord, and someone who'd been working on Paris for a long time turned to me and said, that's the end of Paris. Paris Aid Effectiveness Agenda is dead, which I thought was an unduly negative reaction at the time, because everyone was quite euphoric after Busan, because we thought like we'd got something interesting and new. I think in hindsight, I think what he meant was the idea of holding donor governments, powerful funders of aid, of development, to account in any serious way was dead. And I think he's been proved right. So I'm quite surprised if Brenda, you think the main thing of Busan, the main offer may well be holding governments to account, but there is no serious holding of any governments to account in the current global partnership, and there was under Paris for all its faults. So the question here in this debate is, are there any unintended consequences of perverse incentives? I would say there are no consequences and very limited incentives. So I would back what Tony was kind of implying there. I don't think there's any political traction, very serious political traction within the UK government. Hardly anyone that I know in DFID, especially the new intake, knows the Paris principles in any serious way or takes them seriously. The same can be said of a large amount of the UK NGOs that 10 years ago were mega on the ball in terms of, quotes, better aid, and are now working much less on it. So I'm pretty concerned about this. I think there is a case for the Nairobi conference and the whole process if it's in terms of bringing partners together to talk and learn from each other and all that kind of thing. I think that's, in the job I'm in at the moment, it's going to be very useful for me to make partnerships and to build ideas, and I think that there's a massive case for that. But the idea of holding governments to account, which was fundamentally what it was, is looking really, really worrying. I think we've been asked to be frank. Let's be frank about that. Let's be honest about that. Know which governments are feeling pressure to improve their development effectiveness, their aid effectiveness, let's say, based on this. I would like to know. And I think, at the heart of the problem is a deliberate ambiguity about what development effectiveness means. It is an almost meaningless phrase. Okay, aid effectiveness meant something. Development is hard to define anyway. Development effectiveness is all things to all people. Development cooperation at least means something. So we've got a huge scope. We've got an unclear agenda. It's a perfect ground for politicians to pick and choose and do whatever they want with it. And I think that ultimately, one of the main reasons that Paris worked was that there was a large civil society and southern government coalition to pressure northern governments to improve their aid. And that doesn't exist at the moment. And if that was to be built up again with a clear agenda...
I think I'm going to have to stop you there, Jonathan, but thank you. I think that was a clear point. I mean, Brenda, I wonder if you want to come back on... There's a linked theme here, I think, about kind of what is the theory of change for the global partnership and the offer, and how does that speak perhaps to some of the scepticism that is out there about whether donor governments in particular are feeling under pressure. So maybe I think you could link some of those perhaps in some reflections.
Yes, I mean, I think it would have been interesting to have taken the comment from, there's a member of the Joint Support Team sitting in the audience who had asked to speak, who might want to offer an observation from someone who's closer to the day-to-day processes on this. I mean, certainly in my intervention, I was just pointing out what we have achieved. And I think this audience, when I said don't be complacent, I see everyone sitting back, this isn't interesting, what's happening now, what can I write a paper on? Sorry, I'm being a bit flippant here, but there is a challenge here. Mary Robinson was speaking to the DAC the other week about the work that she's leading, looking at what's the future for the Development Assistance Committee and some recommendations on where we go, and saying this is transformational. We need to think very differently about this. Now, I think I hadn't really been involved in the Doing Development Differently debate, but I think that sounds very, very interesting, that we look at problems, that we look at how we work around what the solutions that are needed on the ground, but be ready to adapt. And I think that this is an area where those of us who are interested in development cooperation, in effectiveness, should join forces. If we constantly look for a new idea because we can raise money about it, then the story that goes to taxpayers around who are paying for aid is that this isn't worth supporting, and we need to grasp this transformation, I think. So, I mean, the point about I wouldn't say that the monitoring survey is the theory of change. It's a point that brings everyone together. I mean, those indicators, many of them, at the global level, they don't tell a great deal other than indicating there's something interesting here or something's going well, but it's when it's discussed at country level that it's important. I agree that we don't have the traction on donor governments that existed in the past, but in the past aid was much more important in the global landscape. But we do have partners who want to come together to talk about how can we work together to be effective. We do have a very good representation there. So let's use that. Not saying that it's perfect or it's delivering everything now, but in development there's been too much of a history of something is a fad and then it's thrown away and we start again somewhere else. There's something here, I think, particularly with the developing countries who take part in the monitoring. There's a conversation there that we should build on. So it's not that we're going to find one answer, one technical answer. It's a very challenging moment at the moment for development cooperation, and I think we should look for where we can make a difference and be transformational. The point on the Paris Declaration evaluation, yes, it did find that the concept of ownership had raised the power of partner countries where they recognise this in the relationship. And there were examples of countries who'd actually done things like had an act of parliament to be more directive about where aid would go, and that had, translated into greater clarity, greater predictability, so it had enabled the effectiveness principles to be applied on the ground. So, it probably is worth looking at what have we learned from the past about what worked and what didn't. It will tell us a lot about incentives. It will tell us a lot about the politics. I think the thing that the European Union did with telling donors where they could operate or not, they didn't want to do that, and actually the developing countries didn't want that either. So, something that looked like a technical solution politically didn't work, and probably in effectiveness terms wasn't the right conclusion to come to. So there's probably a lot of information in there about how we all avoid doing what we say we're going to do because the incentives aren't right or the politics aren't right. Anyway,
Okay,
I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Tony, did you want to comment, perhaps particularly on this question about whether in this move beyond aid, it's actually lost sort of the advocacy ask for civil society, or where this agenda is going from that perspective? I think it would be interesting to get your thoughts.
Indeed, we are very worried that many leaders in the donor countries have actually are now saying that this so-called unfinished business is no longer an issue, and they have killed Paris. Indeed, they also they have killed Paris with the China issue and so on. And it's a question whether it died or was it really killed. But for CPDE, for the CSOs, we have created a new strategy, and we are back in the aid issue. Aid was never abandoned by civil society because ODA is fundamental, it's strategic. But everyone is saying that ODA is passé and so on, especially with Agenda 2030. And voila, we realize that you can have, you cannot implement Agenda 2030 without ODA. And for civil society, the important thing is to make sure that donors deliver on their commitments to Paris, and they remain important. And so for CPDE, we now call it our core business. We're going to go after every donor. We're going to look at their capacity to harmonize. How do they ensure the question of incentives in place and country systems and so on? Indeed, there has to be a shift for CPDE. And this is something that we're going to roll out in Nairobi. Thank you.
Neil, perhaps just some brief comments on a couple of those reflections.
Thank you very much. So just in response to Nalini, and I agree that doing development differently should steer away from the international agreements and probably doesn't have anything to do at that level in shaping an international agreement. I think where doing development differently applies is in the implementation of those international agreements, because it is preoccupied with context. It is preoccupied with the problems that are context specific, and it's the kind of problems that are going to get local actors to sit up. And this links to the point that was made by Romilly about the monitoring framework. If we are monitoring at a country level and we're thinking about this doing development differently approach, that maybe what we should be monitoring is not so much the results, but the progress that we are making towards those results. Because I think that identifying problems and tackling problems is about how biting off small chunks at a time, the progress that you are making in addressing the problem towards achieving those results. And then the final point, which I suppose my agreement with Jonathan and maybe a nice slogan for the cartoonists, and that is that I think accountability got sacrificed at the altar of all-inclusiveness in Busan. Thanks.
Okay. Paddy, I want to bring some more people in briefly before we close, but a few comments from you perhaps on this question about what are the challenges for implementing DDD. And I think Neil's given us a good outline of where that sits in relation to the broader set of principles.
Yeah, so I want to start by saying that, Nalima, you could be quite right that attempting to codify DDD as part of a process like this could be the death knell for it. So just because they're both trying to make aid more effective and development more effective, it doesn't mean that they should be integrated. And Lenny, you might correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that this DDD business is almost a battle being fought within donors. I mean, you've got people within the donors saying, if we want to make aid more effective, you've got to do it like this. And for them to win, Thomas, you were arguing, asking what it would take to kind of get more of this, get more traction with these approaches. They have to win the argument that if donors want to demonstrate that their money is being well spent, this is the better way of doing it. And it's a heck of a problem because, of course, doing development differently means recognizing failure, which is a politically difficult thing to do.
Okay, we've got time for another round of questions, and I know that there was a question over here that I didn't come to. Was it? No? Okay. Change the mind. Okay, we'll come here, this lady. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Phyllis Makau, and I'm the Director of Parliamentary Budget Office of Kenya. Looking at this, and I'm grateful to the panel, it's obvious because of choices, they've been left behind. So when you come to the slogan, leave no one behind, they're already behind. So we're actually at the point of implementation. So at the point of implementation, how can we get them to be involved? And there are issues here. Because when we talk of why they are left behind, is because they are not stakeholders when these decisions are being made. Then the second issue, and that's what Neil Cole brought up, is the issue of when the information is not there in the budget, so they don't even get to know what is happening. Then the second issue is the issue about the legislature, the parliament. And many a time, one may imagine it is just simply the appropriation. But they are the representative of those people who've been left behind. So the issues moving forward is to look at how information can be accessible at the implementation stage. And that could be an agenda that as you move on to Nairobi, you can find out how are we making information on official aid to everyone. I know someone talked about Wi-Fi and all those issues not being available. But if that is a status, they don't know. The second issue is about legislation. And the legislation may not be to do with appropriation. It's the issue of whether we don't want to look about participation at implementation, at planning, so that everyone gets involved. And those are very critical issues which, when you look at effectiveness of aid, it is actually never becomes effective because it is on a different road, and the people affected, they are on another road. So they basically know that in the other road, there are trains, there are buses, there are bicycles. They are bystanders. And we may have to look back at how we were achieving using the PRSPs, that is the poverty strategy papers, where there was more emphasis on participation of everyone. And now we are talking about SDGs and all others, but participation has taken a back door. And I agree it is being also slaughtered at the altar, like accountability. And if we lose participation, then there is no way you can say we are inclusive.
Great, thank you. Any other reflections people want to bring in? Yeah, we have one here.
Yes, from France. I wanted to react to the gentleman from Ipsos, and his interesting remarks, very interesting remarks, because he's putting the tough questions, pretty much the same question as Simon on the Daily Mail symptom, you called it. In other words, the aid industry is in danger. What I'd like to say is that, sure, if we look at events like the Nairobi gathering, or the Mexico gathering, or the Busan gathering, or the Accra gathering, I remember that strange vision of four-wheel drive traffic jams in Accra of people discussing on poverty. It's hard to get political traction on these kinds of things. And yet, I'm not sure that the battle is lost. Certainly in France, I would suggest that even with declining ODA levels, there is great concern. And there's great concern. Why? Because we are being hit directly by issues of development, such as migration, such as issues of development within our country. I'm thinking of the problems we have in our banlieue with our terrorists. So I think we need to just see things in perspective. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Great. Well, I think two good comments, really, rather than questions, I think, for the panel. It seems to me it would be good if we could just have some final reflections from those sat up here. And maybe rather than kind of trying to sum up, perhaps just give us one takeaway, one thing to take to the next high-level meeting, or one thing you'd like to see change about the current set of principles or agenda based on some of what we've been discussing. And I think I'll go in reverse order. So I will turn to you first, Paddy.
Well, this doesn't really proceed from anything that I've said so far, but I just want to agree with, I think it's Phyllis, that why not ask a bit more when it comes to the transparency and the dissemination of information at the local level. I mean, just putting some numbers in a database in the OECD doesn't seem to me going far enough.
Neil.
Maybe come back to a point I made about some of the responsibilities that need to be taken by partner countries. They certainly need to be a lot more unified in their dialogue and the approach that they take when negotiating with partners, because sometimes we find that there are contradictory incentives where especially ministries of health prefer not to use the country system because that is perceived to be providing the ministries of finance with too much power, and also the threat of maybe a trade-off that is going to disadvantage health, as in this example. So I think that countries need to be taking a more unified position and a view on how they want to move forward to strengthen these systems, which, starting to use the systems plays a large part in strengthening them.
Okay, great, thank you. And Tony, sort of one takeaway for us, please.
I believe that aid and effectiveness are such important strategic issues that they have to be refreshed regularly, and that's the role of the HLM. Because then you'd have always questions, doubts, debates, but you need to refresh them, and we're good to go.
Okay, and Brenda.
Well, I think Tony just put it very well. I'll be very interested to hear what comes out in Nairobi, because I think we're at a moment where we can't exactly predict it, but let's find out what's actually relevant now and what's relevant to the Agenda 2030 challenge. But yes, never take things for granted. It's never a technical solution. We need to refresh what we're doing.
Great. Well, thank you. I mean, some interesting pushback, I think, from our panel, actually, around efforts to kill off or admit defeat about some of this agenda, although recognition that some things maybe have been sacrificed along the way, like accountability. I really like the calls for us to be less faddish, to kind of maintain and build on what we know and have learned, rather than look for the next acronym. And to me, some very good points about what the link really is between some of the different agendas. You know, some are about the overall broad international frameworks, others are about how you put those into practice. But let's be clear, I think, about what those connections are. The bit that for me we had a bit less on, or seem to have less clarity on, is really still about what that beyond aid agenda and offer is. And I hope that's something we can come back to, including this afternoon in some of the further discussions. But can we just thank our panel for a really rich set of insights and sharing their experience.